where history's shadows cast long, unsettling doubts, the truth lies buried. From cryptic wartime codes to assassinations that scarred generations, unearth the secrets the world tried to forget. Host Tim Gardner guides you through a labyrinth of unanswered questions where every clue pulses with danger and intrigue, and perhaps an opinion or two. It's not all facts because history never is. Welcome to the Ciphered Past.
Episode of Ciphered Past, episode 14. I am Tim Gardner. I am honored to have the great Stu Wexler here tonight, and Stu has been considered as one of the top investigative researchers in domestic terrorism and radical religious activities. His books include The Awful Grace of God and America's Secret Jihad. You can pick those up at Amazon, right, Stu? And your other retailers that are out there. His groundbreaking work on forensics and historical crimes has been featured on NBC News and in the Boston Globe, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, USA Today, and the Clarion Ledger. Currently is in New Jersey, in a snow-ridden New Jersey right now, where he continues the great fight and the great work of research, and he is just an amazing, deep, knowledgeable man, and I am honored to have the great Stu Wexler on the show tonight. Stu, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely. And where to start? I mean, 2025 was a really good year when it comes to progress with the JFK assassination and just the records and things of that nature. I would start saying that people are disappointed to a certain extent because they wanted to get the guy behind the grassy knoll and all the big news. But I think for a lot of us who actually anticipated this, Stu, it wasn't going to be that. It was just going to be stuff that was in document form. And personally, I believe if any really smoking gun would have been destroyed probably right after the assassination. So I would definitely love to hear your take on that.
So it's funny you should mention that. I've been at the Kennedy assassination game for a very long time from a very young age. It's almost genetic, comes down from grandparents and my father. And so since I was 12 or 13, I'm 49 years old now, going to be 50 in February of next year. And uh, I was going down when the first set of documents were being released under the JFK Records Act when I was 17, 18 years old. And there's a video, and it's been put on um, uh, MSNBC a few times, where NBC News at the time, MSNBC didn't exist, interviews me outside of, and this was actually the original archives because the NARA had not yet even been completed yet. Archives 2, they sometimes call it. I was at Archives 1, the original one in Washington, D.C. And you could see me, you could see Jeff Morley in the background where I'm standing. I didn't even know who he was at the time. He was probably just starting out. I was super skinny at the time. I still had hair. Um, and, I it's a funny situation because they gave me a half a compound sentence and edited out everything else. My first experience with media being screwy. Then Newsweek, by the way, took the half a compound sentence, called me a conspiracy freak, and had me say some of the wildest additional things that I never said. Um, Oddly, I never talked to a Newsweek reporter, right? And suddenly I'm in their Newsweek. What I had actually said was when they pulled me out, this is to your question, do you expect to find a smoking gun? They took this whole thing out. I said, anything that would amount to an actual smoking gun uh, would probably be down the toilet by this point in time or in the paper shredder. Um, Maybe some things that are really important have gotten away, but mostly what you're going to have is parts of a puzzle. It's going to be a mosaic. I might not have used those exact words. And, this is just the start of what we're needing to do. And it takes a long time to put together the mosaic. And people like Jeff Morley, but John Newman, maybe the top one is Malcolm Blunt. Like, none of them are one document guys. They're like 48, murder board, you know, string connected document kind of guys. And that's, you'll have stuff. I mean, there was recently somebody put out a document. It's not smoking gun at all, but it's pretty important where the CIA is basically saying, let's see if we could doctor the image of the guy coming out of Mexico City, who they said was Oswald, but really doesn't look like Oswald, but some people think might be Ruby. It's not Ruby, but they were worried that that confusion could be there. Let's see if we could basically do the equivalent of photoshopping it in 1960,
Wow.
right? In 1963. Greg Burnham found that, put it on JFK Education Forum. I mean, it's not a smoking gun, but man, it shows you that they were capable and were seriously thinking about doctoring evidence, which creates a whole other layer of problems for trying to make sense of the material, because now you got to start to wonder if people are playing a little bit of games. So, to your point, I don't think we're going to get a smoking gun. I think we're going to get a mosaic. I think that it's going to be more than documents. I think people have to get, especially now because we're running out of time because of age, you got to get a hold of people in these agencies. And everybody says everybody's dead. The exiles who get accused of, some sort of connection to this case, they were like 21, 22 in 1963. Some of them are still alive, maybe not for very much longer. Um, there's one guy who shows up in a lot of the work that I helped Larry Hancock with in his book, named Carl Jenkins. I think Carl Jenkins is still alive. He's 100. And like mentally there, right? We got to start putting that stuff together. The documents with the witnesses, it's going to be multiple documents intersecting. You got to be open minded, you got to be curious, and you got to be willing to challenge your own thinking on things and modify it. But I don't, and people who are thinking we're going to get the identity of the person on the grassy knoll,
Mm-mm.
I think you're wishful thinking.
Mm-mm.
It's
Mm-mm.
there is a possibility because duplicate documents show up all over this place, triplicate, and maybe you got rid of five and there's the sixth. That's happened in history. That's how we have a more firm understanding, for instance, of what happened with Japanese internment and with the Holocaust, because some people they couldn't get rid of all the documents that they wanted to get rid of. But you're going to be looking for needle in a haystack if those documents exist. My guess is. So that's how I would answer your question.
And I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think you're not going to find any of that stuff, especially the shooters, right? I mean, the shooters, they were grunt level, in my opinion, right? I think that there were many layers to this, and I'll just give you kind of a little hypothesis to this, right? You had the kind of top guys that planned everything. You had the people that were kind of help facilitating that actually were able to drop down the orders, and that's why and again, I don't want to offend anybody out there that's watching the show. I feel like the mob and the people that we hear the names of all the time, like the David Ferries and all these other kind of grunt people from New Orleans, they are grunts, right? That's just my opinion, right? I feel like anybody that was around that area there, you're never going to find out who it was because they really weren't that important in the grand scheme of things. And on my last show, we were talking about like why in the world is somebody like a Gordon Howard famous? Why is a Gordon Howard famous when we don't even know if the guy was standing up there with this fake badge man thing going on? I mean, let you know what my point is about this. So these people are famous about this whole situation, but the real key players that are really important, that need to be found out. I mean, you don't even know who they are. And so that's my point. You're never going to know who these shooters are. You're just going to see these people that are kind of irrelevant to the whole story that are famous.
Right.
Sorry.
Right. Well, you're not going to put, if it's an operational situation,
Right.
why the heck would you ever put the people's names down on paper?
I
Right?
agree.
You don't have to put a lot of things down on paper.
Right.
Um, to the extent that you might find shooters, it's because they're connected to other operations where they didn't care that their names were on paper, right? But the idea that's going to say, "Hey, let's get Manny Ramirez onto the grassy knoll, and Jack, and give him $55 and $55,000 and pay him off to go to Guatemala or whatever you want to do," ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I generally agree with you. I mean, I think it's tricky because there's a world, and it tends to be the one I go with, where the larger, well-planned operation that I think was, in fact, directed at Castro, that the next tier of people below shifted that on JFK. Um, I don't know, and again, I'm very open-minded about these kinds of things. I don't know if like the people who are technically responsible for the apparatus and the sort of mechanisms and shenanigans that we tend to associate with setting up the JFK assassination knew what was going to happen on November 22nd. They may have been caught to some extent with their pants down too. And it could also have been that somebody who was high level and went rogue is still somebody who's like a big name, like just throwing it out there, like a James Angleton or a William Harvey. They were trying to make it look bad for the Richard Helmses of the world, because then you get a cover up, right? If you do it the right way, you're going to force cover ups because people don't want you to know about the other operations they were connected to. They don't want to look like they had anything to do with the JFK assassination. They don't want you to know about all the other sort of sketchy stuff that they might have been up to. So you get a cover up just by choosing the right, just by working the system, so to speak.
That is fascinating. So let's. I got a side question now because you brought up something fascinating. So you think deliberately that the CIA guys, those top CIA guys, would actually go against each other pretty much to make each other look bad? Am I correct? I mean, not for a fact, but I'm saying it was a possibility. Is that
So,
correct?
so not all of them, if you know the histories of it, not all of them got along with each other. Some of them were suspicious. There were internal rivalries, and frankly, I think there are people who are like, you know, it's not that they wanted to frame, say, I'm just throwing this out there, that they wanted to frame James Angleton. I think ultimately what they wanted to do was frame Fidel Castro and the Soviets, and they failed because they did too good of a job, um, and that triggered a cover up. But they were, I mean, these, what a lot of people don't ever talk about and should, is everyone's taking a risk. It's not like people think these are people like the line from JFK, they walk through the raindrops. You get caught trying to kill the president, you're going to be executed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're not only not going to have a career, you're going to be executed. There are risks involved.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to make sure you're going to get out of this, even if it doesn't succeed, that people are going to cover for you, or you want to try. That would be my guess. This is all supposition. So I do think it's at least a possibility. And again, I'm just speculating here, that if you're somebody like William Harvey, you don't care if, again, I'm just throwing it out there, somebody like Richard Helms is forced into a situation where he has to cover for you. And he
Mm.
may not even know what happened. Where I come back to it, where I think a lot about this is I think about the work of fiction that David Phillips put out. And it might be a work of fiction, but I take it very seriously. When he says, I was, and he in the character of who he's speaking of, I was Lee Harvey Oswald's case officer. We had used him to try and kill. We had him involved in a plan to try and kill Castro. That plan was used on Kennedy in Dealey Plaza, and we were caught hanging in the wind, not knowing what the heck happened. And I live with that guilt, right? I tend to think there's a lot of truth in that fiction.
Mm,
Um, in fact, that's my dominant theory of what likely happened in the Kennedy assassination.
wow. That makes sense too. Wow. So Oswald himself, I mean, like, what? Okay, I keep thinking about this because I mean, lately the trending topic, because things are pretty slow right now, obviously, is the Beale Wesley Frazier with the quote unquote pre-type confession that he was involved in the assassination some way or that he claims. Okay, um, now is that accurate? I don't know. But Oswald's involvement per se, okay? I'm in the camp, and this is just my opinion, and I just want to state that out there, that I believe that Oswald didn't pull a trigger in two instances. I don't think he did it on Tippit because of the timing after you shoot a president, allegedly. Why would you go ahead and run to your boarding house after going on a bus, then going to a cab, then going to the boarding house, grabbing your gun when you should have had your gun in the first place after you shot the president? And then you go over to Oak Cliff, you decide to meet with an officer, then you shoot the officer, and then you go over to the theater, and then you like sit next to people and you order popcorn, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I think with all the obvious things that, whether it be the paraffin tests, this guy was, to me, and I'm just what I'm saying, Stu, is I think this guy was really like he was a patsy, but I think he was just, what do they call it when something is just
In
I
over
think
his
he was
head.
a, yeah, exactly, way over his head.
I tend to agree with you. I go back and forth a lot. Um, my general take um, is what makes the most sense to me is he looks like somebody, and many people have gone down this path. I think it's sort of insinuated in Larry Hancock, who's my co-author in a number of books. I love his books. If you're out there, his books on the Kennedy assassination, I think, are some of the best books there are. Books like Someone Would Have Talked. His most recent book is a little bit more controversial, but I tend to agree with it up to about 90% of the way. And where I think you're dealing with, Oswald thought something else was going to happen that day. I think it's distinctly possible he brought a rifle to the building the night before. I think he may have thought that there was going to be a fake assassination attempt. I've always thought that was a pretty good explanation. What doesn't make sense is the first 15 minutes of what he's doing. First off, it's tough to get him up to that floor and then back to the second floor, much less outside the building, which maybe is true. I don't even know what to do with Prayer Man. Either way, if he's on the second floor, even under that scenario, he's super calm, right? The one assassination I think he definitely understood and knew what was going to happen and may have even fired the shot, I don't know, is Walker. But if you read what Marina said he was like after the Walker shooting, he was a freaking nervous wreck and he didn't even kill the guy. Right? And so and nobody died. And so here he is right after the assassination, people are pulling guns on him and he's like super calm. He goes outside, uh meanders over to a cab and appears to have offered the cab to a woman like a southern gentleman, to an older lady. You just, according to the way the official version, just shot and killed the president of the United States. and you're willing to let somebody else get the cab, I don't think, charm. Then you just go on a bus and you go and you hang out at your, you go to your apartment, which, as you said, if you had, wanted to, kill the president, why didn't you have your pistol with you? But by the time, even right there, I think things are going through his head, possibly because of stuff that was on the radio. He's asked to be dropped off past the house before he goes in and gets the gun. Then you get the weird incident with the cop car. But at that point, I don't know with him, because I do think there's a scenario. You have to work your way through the physical evidence and the witness testimony. It gets complicated. I do think there's a scenario where he's freaking the heck out. And maybe at that point, you're willing to shoot a police officer because you don't know what the heck just happened to you, right? Maybe. I don't know. I think you go into the theater. I've always been with a lot of other. I think he was trying to meet somebody. Larry says it's because he thought he was going to be part of like a plane hijacking, and maybe he had no idea of a shooting. And I think that's a distinct possibility now, more so than I thought before after the Larry's book. Any way you slice it, I think he's trying to meet somebody and get out of town. What I will say is this, and I don't think it's why I think there's the one gap that I wish, if I could get all the great researchers together and assign them one thing to do. No matter what you think happened that day in terms of Oswald's involvement, he could have been the dumbest, most unwitting patsy you've ever imagined, or he could have fired off some shots, right? Any way you have it, whoever is to get to who did it, at least from the bottoms up, it still has to connect to him, because you're not going to set somebody up, even as a stupid patsy, if you can't guarantee, or if not guarantee, have a very good idea that you can anticipate what he's going to do, know where he's going to be, and have some level of influence over what he's going to do. Now, you may overrate your ability to do that, but you have to be confident you're going to do that, because otherwise he could be on the freaking middle of, on the opposite side of Dealey Plaza, being filmed, in front of Rosemary Willis and Howard Brennan stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't take the risk. So I would ask that all researchers, if we could, put our heads together, I think the biggest sort of hole in the Kennedy assassination is who was in a position to influence his actions, immediate actions, in Dallas, late October through November 22nd. You really got to pin down on that. And that'll get you to where you need to go, I think, eventually upwards. It might be tricky. Um, and if you're gonna go top down, I think you're the ultimate way you close the circle is to get to somebody like that, right? At
Mm.
that level, somebody he's associating with, somebody who's calling him, somebody he's meeting up with. What is that about? And so, to your point, he's a tricky character. I think, and I said this long, for years, and then Larry and David Boylan put it in their book. I think he had his own agenda, and he just didn't realize that he got into a little bit of a vortex where he wasn't controlling, where they were manipulating him, thinking that he thought he was following his own agenda, and he was not following his own agenda. And that's my 2 cents on him.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I got a two-part question, but I got a point first. Amazing. So like when he's being interviewed by the press for a brief time, I always call this probably the biggest giveaway in the whole case. When he's like, I just been told I'm being charged for shooting an officer, and he's like, "Did you kill the president?" He's like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And he's like, "Well, you've been charged." And then you see that look on his face, and he's just, I mean, it's probably the most. I mean, you see that it just. I mean, I've taken a screenshot of that, and the look of the guy just like going, "Oh my god."
Can I tell you that's funny that you say that, because I was gonna go there, and I know it's body language, and you can't completely hang your hat on it. But in recent couple years, I mean, I've always seen it. In recent couple years, because body language people have tried to take it on, I've looked at it more closely. And I don't know if you see it. This is what I see it. I see his face saying, kind of in his head, a sort of like, are you freaking kidding me? That's what these guys are now trying? Not the police. Like, oh my God, these people who set me up have massive gonads. That's what I think that's what it looks to me like. Whoa. And he can't be fully, I've always thought he can't be fully transparent, because he was probably doing some things that either are going to get him hooked into, convicted potentially falsely for that, or convicted for other crimes. Everybody's always like, he lied about, the walker, or would have lied about owner. Yeah, you're damn right he did. If he did have something to do with that, he's a accessory to attempted murder. Doesn't mean you kill the president of the United States, but that's how I would get that guy hooked into and have him thoroughly blackmailed, so to speak, thoroughly extorted. If I involved him in a shooting attempt on General Walker and I could prove it, that guy is excuse my language, he's my bitch, right?
Right.
Right? Because at that point, whatever I do with him, if he's in that station, he's gonna be going through all the oh shit, they freaking got my rifle, right? That's what
Mhm.
that whole interview was. That's what I see his face saying. I see it saying, like, I can't believe these mofos.
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
mofos aren't the police. The mofos aren't the FBI. The mofos are the people he's like, yeah, they got me.
Mhm.
They got
That's
me, and now I'm in a very tricky situation. And when you say you're a patsy, you're not always saying you're completely innocent. You're saying you're the one who's taking the complete fall,
the
right? Um, so again, I mean, I think that's a I've always, and it's funny that you mentioned, because it's the last several months. Few times I've come across people who've been trying to body language, because there's the online body language thing now online on YouTube is crazy. The amount of people who do it. And I don't put a huge amount of stock in it. I put some stock in it. But I'm not seeing the Cheshire cat smile that, Posner's, and I'm not seeing like complete shock and surprise. What I'm seeing in that picture is, I can't believe that's where they're taking this.
I would agree. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of trauma in my life, right? So like whenever I've heard news about certain things, I mean, I'm really good at gauging things, right? So whenever I hear news, I always think about stuff that goes through my head, right? And then I look at the person, across the way. And so I agree with you. I looked at him and he's just like okay. One thing that I would say, Stu, I think that there is a line of arrogance there because I feel like he thought that he was protected. Okay. I feel like that he was because he had worked. I mean, there's layers about this guy, whether it be FBI connections or even CIA connections. I mean, there's layers with this guy. I mean, we could talk about this on a 4 or 5 hour show, but we wouldn't even have enough time. But I mean, especially his background, like, is there two Lees and like the whole John, what's his name? Uh,
Armstrong.
yeah, the whole thing. But we're not going to get into that. But my point is that I looked at him and I was just like, uh, this looks like a guy that didn't shoot the president. I mean, like it did. I mean, he looks really like, huh? I mean, he's just, but you're right. Like the same angle that like, this happened. I mean, like befuddled. Yeah, that's my best
Almost
interpret.
frustrated, like you
Yeah,
can't really say what you want to say,
yeah, yeah.
but you got, frankly, excuse my language, fucked.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Yeah, and which would lead me to believe, like, I mean, and I want to talk about the Mornshield and Maurice Bishop here in just a second, because you brought up a really good point before this about how, how Maurice Bishop, aka obviously David Atlee Phillips, was in his writings, but we'll talk about it in a second. But I want to get back to Oswald real quick, because what's really interesting about that is that um, I always thought the backyard photo was one of the things where you look at the 38 that killed Tippit is right on his holster. You have the gun that kills the president, and it's Captain Obvious, the whole photo, right? Now, people out there talk about like that was doctored. I tend to believe I go towards that area because I look at that face, the shadowing, and everything like that. And I'm not a photo expert. These are just my opinions. I tend to believe that that photo was faked or staged, because off the air you talked about some CIA thing where they looked like they were going to manipulate something on a camera in Mexico City, and we can talk about that in just a bit. But if they had that type of technology back then, what makes anyone think that they couldn't do that to that particular photo with the murder weapon with on both people? I mean, that's just a question for you.
So I always go a little bit back and forth, as I do with everything in this case, on that photo. Um, there's been some studies which suggest scientifically it's unlikely that it was fake. The bigger things for me that it wasn't, that suggest it probably wasn't fake, are people who say they saw a photo like it. Marina claims she took the photo. The Demoran Schultz, the hunter of the fascist language on it. People, the one that's less known, it apparently was sent. I think Frontline uncovered this. It was sent. Weisberg may have found out about this and never really wrote about it to the worker. Um, but everybody looks at that photo and they say, "Oh, he's just handing everything out on a silver platter for the Kennedy assassination." The timing of that photo was for the Walker. And I go back to the point I made before. If, are there people who are trying to, maybe not even with an eye towards Kennedy? Like, I think Lee Harvey Oswald was very much trying to set himself up. I think he was on the periphery of intelligence. I think intelligence absolutely had an interest in him, but I don't think he was an intelligence asset. Not when he went to Russia. I think he was being watched. Long story, we could get there if you want to. But I think he always wanted to be an adventurer, a spy, loved the James Bond, loved the I Led the Three Lives thing. Um, and I think he was trying to manufacture an image for himself so that he could get into certain circles and convince people that he's a serious player. Um, and similar to other things, I think he actually eventually succeeds. I think I don't think he ever really was a player. But remember, when he goes into the places in New Orleans and to Exiles and Silvio, or wherever you want to say it, and he's like, "I'm a badass. I was in the Marines. I can train people. I have this, Marine guerrilla warfare manual that I carry around with me." Those people didn't know that Nelson Delgado rigged his shooting score so that he can make marksmen. They just know he was a Marine. And more importantly, they know that he's somebody who has a image, complicated issue, of being pro-communist. And if you're going to try and get somebody into Cuba, for instance, to try and kill Fidel Castro, the only people Castro was letting near him in a physical vicinity at that time were these defector types who were willing to go in and do propaganda for him. He loved those kinds of people. And so I think he eventually gets into that. And that's why I can see the backyard photo as just being his own legend building. Everybody's like, "Oh, he's always a dupe. He's always manipulated." And this is what I think one of the key arguments that Larry made, that I've kind of made before. I think they did a much more thorough job. I don't think people give him enough credit um, for what he's trying to do for himself, his own agenda, having his own mission, his own worldview and vision of who he's going
Mm-hmm.
to be. And then it gets mixed up with people who have a very dark idea of what they ultimately want. I think that's where this comes in. And that's why I'm very willing to believe that that photo may well be or genuine,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not me. Hey, I'm going to shoot John Kennedy on November 22nd using
Mm-hmm.
these weapons.
Well, and as you mentioned perfectly just a few minutes ago, they had something as a linchpin or something that they could refer to with the Walker shooting, right? So
Yes.
the fact that he was able to have this photo, right? Let's just say this was an authentic photo, and I'm kind of in the middle here, right? But if it's an authentic photo, that's another piece that they can add along with the Walker shooting.
And let me add something to that to you real quick. One of the things you mentioned, DeMoranshil, towards the end of his life, right before he commits suicide, yet another one of these, you can't even make this shit up. Um, right when he's about to commit suicide, he gives a series of interviews. And one of the people he gives interviews to is Edward J. Epstein, who's famous for writing a very astute critique of the Warren Commission report and then becoming one of its chief defenders. Although he's willing to dabble with James Angleton, like specifically James Angleton, like not like like he was James Angleton was his primary source for his book Legend into like Soviets did it type of conspiracy theories. But he interviews George de Mohrenschildt. And one of the stories that George de Mohrenschildt that came out was that George de Mohrenschildt was interacting with a person by the name of J. Walton Moore, who was like a local CIA type of guy in the Dallas area. And he eventually goes to J. Walton Moore, according to, accounts. I think it's his account. Many people don't distrust it. And he says, there's this guy Oswald who's just recently moved into town, and he's hanging out in the White Russian community. Do you know anything about him? And J. Walton Moore knows who he is and says, oh, he's just a harmless, lunatic or something along those lines. Whatever. But he told Edward J. Epstein that he had told or shown J. Walton Moore the backyard photographs, right? And I'm not saying J. Walton Moore killed Kennedy or anything to do with. There's no evidence for that. But if J. Walton Moore passes that up and it goes into certain chains, right? Suddenly, again, there's something there. I'm not saying they did it deliberately. Again, I don't think they're sitting there thinking, "Let me set Oswald up." It may have been a situation where they just found out about stuff after the fact, and now they have him,
Mm.
right? Um, and so again, to your point, that's sort of that story. It just goes in a flow. I think there's a trail where he's getting onto people's radars by the spring and then the summer of 1963. He's trying to get on their radars. That's where I think people don't who think he was just puppet mastered around. Uh, and I think he succeeds. What he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't realize is he's succeeding with people who are going to do, who hate both Kennedy and Castro and are going to do whatever they can to get both guys. Castro first, but if you have to kill Kennedy to get Castro, you're willing to do a lot to get there. Sorry, I talk a long time when I get onto these things. So let me go
No,
back to you.
no, this is fantastic. I'm just absorbing it. Yeah, I mean, and then obviously his ties to the Soviet Union, and so for a public perception of this assassin, right? At that time, you could convince and sell to the American public that not only do we have the photo of this guy with two of the murder weapons, he also has ties to the Soviet Union. He hates this country, quote unquote. That's just me speculating, right? But that's
Oh,
also.
I think I might take it a little bit more even to the Castro side. What I thought, and again, supposition, speculation, and I'm not the only one who's thought this. Many a person has thought this, or maybe not exactly this way, but enough people have. Which is, if you're gonna do the frame Castro thing, right? Because his most immediate up to November 22nd, his most immediate public associations are pro-Castro, including, apparently trying to get there and from Mexico City. You have to freeze the Soviets from interacting if you invade Cuba. And so if you can portray him as like kind of Soviet connected, you may be able to keep the Soviets confused enough to give yourself and buy yourself enough time to go into Cuba and do something. I certainly think if he would have been used to kill Castro, which that's sort of my thing, um, uh, then connecting him to the Soviets is incredibly important because you need to freeze the Soviets out of a post Castro Cuba, right? And the way you freeze them out is to blame the hardcore communists and the Soviets for Castro's death, and then let the more right wing Cuban exile components take over the government of Cuba. You're never, in other words, you want to make sure that whatever Cuba that emerges at post Castro, if you kill him, is a Cuba where the Cuban people don't want to have anything to do anymore with the Soviets. That would have been a brilliant play if you were going after Fidel, if you were trying to do a Castro assassination attempt using Oswald. Now, if that fails, and by the way, I don't think Oswald would have followed through with a Castro assassination attempt in Cuba. I'm with Larry and I'm with Dave Boylan, and it's very controversial. I think personally, in his own mind, he was a leftist in his own mind. Um, it may not look like he's a leftist if you showed it to like Angela Davis, who's like spent her whole life studying and teaching leftist philosophy. But for a self-studied leftist, I think he was a leftist. I think he did possibly want to be a hero to Cuba, and I think he thinks he pulled one over on the exile folks he was associating with. That he was going to go to Cuba, expose everything, and become a hero to the revolution. All of that failed. And then the people inside that operation, in my opinion, turned the operation on JFK.
Hmm. Wow. You mentioned in the beginning of the interview, which is really, it stuck with me. That you believe that he was part of, he thought that he could have been part of something else that day, right? So, can I speculate what I think that he thought that he was going to do that day? This is just me thinking at the top of my head. I think that he potentially thought he could be heading to Cuba that day for a particular. I don't want to sound like a MacGyver type guy, like a mission or something. But I think, like you mentioned through this whole interview, which I find brilliant, is that because I can understand that, because if you look at his mannerisms, right, you see that when he was interviewed on that radio station, and you could tell that he was a go-getter. He wasn't the type, like, like Posner said, that he was like a loser seeking glory and all that. He may have been seeking glory to a certain extent, but it was for his own extent. It wasn't for like, I'm going to go kill the president and I'm going to brag about it, and all this other stuff. It just, that's not how it went down. So anyways, to circle this question, I mean, like, I think that he had to have like either, I think that they may have like had a facade of him going somewhere. And I think that he, like you said perfectly, is I think that he was trying to work his way up to get into this intel, either agency or whatever he was a part of. That's what I believe. And so I think that maybe in turn, they were like, well, screw this guy. We're just going to set him up.
Well, I don't think I mean, what Larry and Dave Boylan argue is that he thought that day, and I don't know if you're familiar with the whole Redbird Airport incident. They think that the whole Redbird Airport incident is essentially people prepping Oswald and Oswald thinking he's going to hijack a plane, which he's talked about, according to his wife before, hijack a plane and get to Cuba and again, become a potentially a hero to the revolution. And that maybe what happened with Dealey Plaza was that was meant, that he was told that was going to be some sort of distraction, right? That would allow him to easily pull off the hijacking. And then everything got way, if you're told it was going to be a fake shooting, and then, or a smoke bomb or something, and then suddenly it turns out to be, no, actually, those guys actually really killed him. Your whole world starts
Mm,
to, right. And again, he may not at that point to try and be, so it does people don't, I don't think he thought they were setting him up to yet as the killer shooter of the president, just as somebody who was going to be connected to the crime. And then they say, "Did you shoot the president?" And things start going on in his head,
mm,
right?
mm-hmm,
Well, I can't believe that's where these mofo's were taking it, right?
mm-hmm,
Um, the hijacking thing makes sense to me. Um, you know, it makes better sense than sort of the old theory, and then it was Larry's book. It's the John Martino fully that they were going to try and quote unquote fly him somewhere in South or Latin America to get him out of the country. I guess Cuba would qualify as, in some way, as this. But I do think, again, a lot of this is speculation because you don't have Oswald, the direct participants in the plaza. You don't, or in the setup in Dallas. You, to my point earlier, you don't really know their names, although Larry and Dave do a pretty good job of assembling a nice possibility list,
mm-hmm.
and some of whom are still alive. Um, the and I'm with you. He I think he thought he was going to be in Cuba within a couple of days,
Mm,
and things really did not go his way because the people, as you said, they caught on to his game eventually too.
mm,
And they're like, as you said, yeah, we're gonna put this on somebody. This is the guy we're gonna put it on. He actually works better in this scenario than he did in the one we had where he was gonna try and kill Castro.
wow. Yeah. I mean, that kind of makes me sit and think about it real quick because I mean, like you mentioned perfectly, like um, you think it's something that we're gonna put together piece by piece, and then that's I mean, as you kind of sort through this, Stu, which is really fascinating to me. Things really start to kind of make some sense in regards to like because why I say that is because we like to talk about Oswald himself, right? But we never really delve into like his character. We just know that we like to label him as like this guy was innocent and he didn't kill Tippit and Kennedy and like, but we don't go in the substance of like who he was, and so like his mannerisms and like what he wanted to gain for himself and his family, and that's why I feel like the morning of when he left the house or like he when he left the money for Marina and allegedly I again I these are all accounts, but um that may have been a thing where like he knew he was going to go to Cuba. And he it wasn't to kill the president, but it may have been a thing like hey I'm going to be gone. I don't know if I'm ever going to come back. Who
Right,
knows?
and here's some money where if you could try and get to me there with our babies, try to. I read something in Weisberg, and I haven't been able to find it again. And if anybody out there finds it, Weisberg's papers at Hood College, he always communicated with other researchers and researchers with him. And Harold Weisberg, for the audience, is one of the deans of research.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote some of the earliest books, the whitewash books. And then he was more responsible than just about anyone for collecting files for us for years. He was Malcolm Blunt before Malcolm Blunt, and he communicated all the time with other researchers. And there was one researcher who said that if you really look at the note that he wrote for that's connected to the Walker shooting, that it actually makes more sense that he's actually plotting a hijacking, and that note is connected to the hijacking than the Walker shooting. I don't know if that's the case. I go back and forth on that, but I do think that was on his mind. I do think he genuinely was associating Cuba in his head with what he thought the utopia was that he wrote about, however off it may have been. It doesn't. Again, this isn't popular all the time in a lot of circles because everyone wants to turn him into like a patriot superhero. I don't think he was.
Mm-mm.
I think Larry Hancock and Dave Boylan, for those of you who want to read their most recent book, I think they do an excellent job of summing him up. Um, I only divert from them in a few places, and that has to do with that I don't. I used to. It's funny they've revisited a lot of things I was saying in like 1999. Not to dismiss it, but they're kind of the mind that he was doing the things he was doing in Mexico City to try and embarrass. Or it was if there was an operation, it was to embarrass the FPCC or whatever. Um, I don't think so. I think he was trying to get into Cuba. What I ultimately think is that in August of 1963, he finally gets um he finally gets his foot in the door into the periphery of the assassination. Well, I don't want to say the exile community, basically as an infiltrator. Like he sees himself as an infiltrator for the pro Castro cause. Um, they may already be on to him, but he sees himself as an infiltrator. And at the same time, if you look at what's happening geopolitically, that's when there's the first effort and the first maneuvers. It's starting for Kennedy to try and get backdoor channels to Cuba. And I don't know how serious Kennedy even was about that, but to exiles, they didn't know either, and they would have thought the worst of it. And to the people in the CIA who were engaged in anti-Castro operations, they would have seen it as, oh, this guy's about to betray us again. Clock. Because if you think Kennedy's going to betray you and make some kind of backroom deal to normalize relations with Cuba, whether that was what Kennedy was going to sincerely do or not, if you sincerely believe that, you may not have a lot of time. So I think they were desperate to get into Cuba and try and kill Castro. Desperate to a point where they were willing to try and take shortcuts, make mistakes, do all kinds of things because they now had a guy who was the one guy who could, you know, Marine background. However, again, we know he couldn't shoot to save his life. They wouldn't know that, right? Um, and he's got pro Castro bona fides and he's got Soviet bona fides. He could be the guy who maybe can get within the vicinity of Castro that you can connect or even have him potentially do a Castro assassination attempt, assist the Castro assassination attempt. Um, I think that's what started in August. I think it was a desperate attempt by September. I could give you all sorts of reasons why I think it was. It failed in large part because it was bumbling and desperate. But the people in it, just like they said the Sylvia Odio, basically telegraphed it. Uh, okay, we didn't kill Castro. Now we're going to kill Kennedy. And Oswald was going to be their tool for that. And they had 3 months to plan for.
That's interesting. Wow. He's the author of The Awful Grace of God and America's Secret Jihad. The great Stu Wexler is here with me tonight. Yeah. So I'm just kind of processing all this because it's a lot to take in. And the story itself, I mean, when I started researching this about 20 something years ago, 22 years ago, 23 years ago, it's funny, this as well because you started when you were 17, probably
13,
earlier, 13, excuse me, yeah. But you said that you went through, you didn't tell me this. I'll say this to you. I went through stages myself. Like, I thought initially it was the mob, and then I grew out of that, and then I thought, hey, it could have been, um, you, you name it. I went through all the different stages, and I've kind of been, at a point now where like nothing surprises me anymore. I kind of keep an open mind about everything, right? I kind of keep an open mind because I've yet to hear. Um, I mean, that's the funny thing about camps, and this is the one thing I wanted to talk to you about. This is where I was leading this question to be. The certain camps that you have in this community, right, where people they die on this hill, whether it be the Mossad people, which honestly, I'm sorry, Stu, I do not agree with that. I
I think it's
defiantly
absurd, but go
disagree
ahead.
with it. Yeah. I also, you to talk about the James Files people, which is just absurd as well. Okay. Um, and then you talk about the, Greer shooting Kennedy, which I think is the most ridiculous thing. That's right up there with the Mossad and the Files thing. And then the Secret Service agent that had the machine gun behind them. What I'm saying is that these people feel like they actually have enough evidence, and like they feel like they could just die on this hill, and to me, I think it's absolutely ridiculous when you look at each and every one of these avenues that they have. And look, I respect everybody, but when you become unrealistic with your theory, I think it's just like, man, I mean, like I don't know what to tell you anymore. You don't like me because I think that the CIA had a part in this thing. I think that it was like an open conglomerate that probably had something to do with this. But I'm not going to die on a hill of something so ridiculous like Greer turned around with a gun and shot, Kennedy.
Yeah,
Witnesses would have saw that. I mean, like people would have said something about it.
would have been the dumbest
Yeah,
attempt at killing somebody in the history of
right.
mankind.
And so I just want to get your full take on this because I know you actually have a really good one.
Um, I well, I mean, I think the people who all want to die on hills are a big reason why, and I understand they're sincere. I'm not trying to assault their character, but I hope they really digest because they're a big reason why we can't solve things. You got to be open minded. Like, why are you personally wedded to who killed them? It becomes an expression of your identity and your political ideology instead of you know what actually happened. End of the day, I'm willing to be convinced of a lot of things. I'm like 70% in one direction, but there's a 30% where you can convince me to go in another direction very easily. Um, and so like I can believe there's scenarios in my head where I can believe that the Air Force and Air Force intelligence did it. And I could give you a whole cohesive potential theory to it. And there's a theory in my head where I can believe uh Mafia did it, although it's tough because it's tougher to get that to Oswald. It's easy to get it to Ruby. It's very difficult to get that in a coherent way to Oswald. Um, but that's also just to the ultimate point. To me, with all of them, you got to get me to the figure of Oswald, especially again in the month before the assassination. If you can't get me there in a credible way, it can't be. I think he might have been CIA in 1959. You got to get me there in 1963, um, and especially in October and November, which I think is the gap. And you know, I can tell you if you want me to hear a story, is exactly how everything fell into place for me and why I'm settled on this particular theory right now.
Sure.
But to your larger point, people can convince me otherwise. I'm very open. So, for instance, I know John Newman's going to come out with a Pentagon Did It book, and I have enough respect for John Newman that I'm keeping my mind open to that possibility, right? Um, but right now, the there's these 4 or 5 really salient facts or fact patterns that the anti-Castro writ large, which can include the mafia, by the way, and probably does, but anti-Castro writ large gets you to November 22nd, and it's the closest you can get for places like the Harlandale address, which we can talk about.
Hmm.
to get to Oswald in Dallas itself. Um, and I can't be 100% on anything until that circle is closed. No, October, November 1963, Oswald.
Well, what I can actually talk about though, because again, I will expand on that question to you real quick, and we can close this up. But I thought you brought something up in the beginning of your response that I thought was brilliant, and it led me to believe that the response was the muddying of the waters. Right? You're muddying the water from what the clear stream should be. Okay, and the clear stream should be what you're looking for is you're looking for fact patterns, right? And this is why when I talked to you off the air about Alan Dulles, and why I feel so passionate about this topic is because of like the World War II phase all the way to the assassination itself, right? So uh, I think there's something there. Okay, I don't know what it is, but I mean, if you look at Lumumba's assassination, you look at the DM brothers assassination, you look at what happened with United Fruit Group. They ousted the president there. Um, Somehow his daughter committed suicide. I mean, look, there's a lot of like really horrible things that happened. And I'm not saying the Dulles brothers are responsible for it, but what I am saying is anytime something was supposed to, I mean, like any country was trying to really change, right? Especially Congo with Lumumba, that got completely overridden. South America with its economy, with the United Fruit Group, it you know, and what I'm getting to full circle on with you, Stu, is that with Kennedy talking about the peace treaty and he's doing quote unquote back channeling with Russia, right? I mean that for me, and this is why I believe that I think that they looked at this guy as a treasonous pig, and what's the cause for a treasonous pig is death. And I think that's how the agency looks at people who even defy them. I'm not saying the agency is the most powerful thing in the entire world. I'm not, because I don't know. But what I am saying is the autonomy that they got from Eisenhower and Truman really allowed them to really make some domestic decisions that they were not supposed to do in the first place.
So, like, to your point, and to both your larger points, like, there's a whole set of theories where if I reached the pearly gates and God said this is who did it, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. Dulles would be one of them. If God told me Greer did it in the limo, I'd be like, you're high, bro, right? So so there's definitely like differentiations. And I agree with you. Dulles was involved in all sorts of chicanery. Um, if you know, it's tricky because there's a lot of people like him, Lansdale, Angleton, and frankly, by the way, there's people on, that people like again ideologically people don't want to go to. Che Guevara, Nikolai Leonov. There are people who have these kinds of, you know, conspiratorial type of minds that they're willing that they can think these kinds of stuff through, not always successfully. I have no problem if they entered the field. Um, you, I need more. I mean, I think, uh, again, I think David Talbot did a pretty good job with Alan Dulles. The only problem is, as I think I've said it to you before we went on, is there's things that cut against and which give me pause. And the one I told you about was that, and there's tape recordings of this, by the way. When a year later, after John Kennedy's killed, Bobby Kennedy's still hanging around as Attorney General. You get the Mississippi burning murders, the three civil rights workers who are killed in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, who I write about in my books. Another dimension to it that's neither here nor there. That was national news, nonstop. One of the biggest FBI investigations in history. And Bobby not only asked that somebody from the outside be brought in to manage it. He personally lobbied Lyndon Johnson for Alan Dulles. Right when Alan Dulles is done with the Warren Commission, and when people like David Talbot say that Bobby's already quasi convinced himself that Dulles was a part of it. And as I said to you, Kennedy runs in social circles, the elite social circles, where the relationships, they're not talked about a lot, but that's not something that maybe that's a book that somebody should write. What was the cocktail party scene like? Not necessarily just in terms of the Kennedy session, just like life. Like you're there with Ben Bradley from the Washington Post and, you know, Des Fitzgerald who's running assassinations. William Harvey doesn't show up at those social circles. He's an outcast, right? Um, my point is that I would not be surprised. I don't begrudge, and for all the reasons you said, like that dude was involved in all kinds of shady, sketchy activity. And if he didn't wasn't involved in it, he knew about it, and he was in that for 2 decades. And I do agree with you that I think many a person thought Kennedy was some sort of communist traitor. They thought it from the Bay of Pigs. They thought it from the Cuban Missile Crisis. They thought it from the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. They thought it from his alleged affair with the East German uh, woman. I forgot her name. Very pretty, by the way, but of course it was John Kennedy's. Doesn't kind of go low brow on those kinds of things. In certain circles with the super patriot crowd and the establishment anti-communist crowd, you find out about that kind of stuff, and this guy becomes you don't even you're wondering if he might even have been termed. Maybe that's how crazy some of those folks are. So I do agree that could have factored in. I wouldn't be shocked if it did. It's just for me the ground up where you go from Oswald upward doesn't get me there necessarily. In other words, they don't have to be a part of the plot. They could be.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, it's just, I mean, I had Paul Blow on about a month ago, and you and him stopped me in my tracks. Really, you guys just, I mean, you gave me pause for thought on everything on this, and so I just that's I would say compliment to you by just how a wealth of knowledge you are. I mean, like you're just listening to you talk about this stuff. It's so detailed is incredible. So I just wanted to thank you. Um, but um, as we're kind of getting into the territory of we already talked about Oswald. We've talked about I want to talk about the facade of like the witnesses and the elimination of the witnesses prior and or let's say post the assassination, right? You got a group you get there, they say there's an upwards of like maybe 50 to 100 or maybe north of 100 people that have died that were in relation to the assassination. Like, I mean, this is a two-part question, okay? So with witnesses and your time in researching this case in general, how many do you feel like have been full of shit or actually been truthful? And then also on the second part of that, the people that have died, many do you actually percentage wise do you believe that were actually related to the assassination? We don't have to give specific names, but a percentile and a take with that.
So to your first question, unfortunately, a ton of them are bullshitters. A ton of the ones that are like, I have inside knowledge, bullshitters. It is an overwhelming, like, unfortunate muddying the waters. And then you got the bullshitters. You got the grifters. You got the fabulous, so sometimes the worst ones because they actually believe some of what they're saying. The other ones you got. So let's say the grifters are the ones who have something. that's true, and then they're trying to exaggerate it and embellish it to make more out of it. That's a big problem. You got the fabulous who believe they're what they're like. I'm not so sure that Judith Baker isn't a fabulous. I don't believe a word she says.
I don't either.
But if do I think it's out of question that she doesn't have some kind of mental thing where she thinks she really did have an affair with Lee Harvey Oswald and was part of a bioweapons program? I could see that. I just don't believe her for a minute. Um, then you got just the sensationalists. There's too many to
Hmm.
count, and they've really poisoned the well on the Kennedy assassination. They do, if you once you realize how many there are and how they operate, they do make you into a better researcher. I will tell you
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
and not just on the Kennedy assassination case. I can't tell you, like the way the Epstein thing's going now. Not going to go too much into depth on that, but it is ripe right now for the kinds of people we got in the Kennedy assassination for 50 years. Um, and that's unfortunate because now we're going to get those victims who are legit are going to get justice for it
Hmm.
because some schmuck is going to come out and say, I saw, Paul McCartney, you know, with 72 with a harem of 72 girls, on Epstein Island, you know, doing the jig with Epstein, and people are gonna freaking believe it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem. To your second point, there's two layers to that. So that sometimes gets overdone from a broad statistical point of view, and the problem is that the domain of people who had something to do with the Kennedy assassination can be literally in the tens of thousands, right? When you consider all the elements. So when somebody says so and so who was a witness on to you know Oswald getting a coke or whatever what it might be, and they wind up dead, you know, from a mysterious car accident. But actually, if in a pool of 10,000 people, it's not unknown that somebody will die in a strange accident, right? In a pool of 10,000 people or 20,000 or 30,000 people, it's not unknown that somebody could even be murdered, even murdered under suspicious circumstances. Now, that being said, you get to some of the people in this case, and it certainly raises an eyebrow,
Hmm.
right? I would say, and then by the way, there's stuff that overlaps, right? So Johnny Roselli, was he killed exclusively because he knew something about the Kennedy assassination? Was he killed because he was talking about other operations that the mafia was involved? Or was it like combination of both?
Yeah. I mean,
Right? Because they're not separate. Like, yeah, he was talking about the Kennedy assassination and he was talking about mafia CIA operations
I can make
and
an
he's willing to just betray the oath of the mafia. You kill him for all of those reasons.
exactly, and I can make an argument right now that with mob culture, I mean, again, I'm not some sort of mafioso guy, but he may have crossed the wrong person in the family or the field, and they had that hit coming for him. Okay, I mean,
Right.
just because he was about to talk at the House committee, or like maybe he already did, or whatever, um, doesn't mean that he got off for that. You know what I mean?
And
And
by the way,
that,
he's an example of a mafia person who, even if he wasn't directly involved in the Kennedy assassination, I'd be if I was, I'd be worried that he knew the people who were right because he was
Mhm.
in those assassination circles. To your point, though, it's difficult to know how much of it was exclusively him and him just talk like just being a mafioso and talking to Congress can get you killed.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter what kind of big thing you might talk about. They have a code.
Mhm.
It's pretty obvious. People much lower than Johnny Roselli have been killed because they said lower level stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, and I wanted to bring up actually you brought up a really good point just a moment ago about like the witnesses and how a lot of them are they are full of shit. But what I would say, there are some that I think had complete validity to them. I see. I'm a big believer in Mark Lane. I think that what Mark Lane did in the early stages, risking his reputation, and look, whatever happened at Jonestown and whatever happened, post the assassination, him representing James Earl Ray, all that other stuff. I don't want to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is the early stages of him, like interviewing like the Aquila Clemenses and the Lee Bowers, these really important people that to me, I feel like they have validity to, right? Because you never heard from like Aquila Clemens
Well,
literally ever again, right?
I agree with you 100%. I should be clear. It's you have to take him on a case by case basis, and you have to be skeptical. She's somebody that doesn't mean she's got the final answers or
Mm-hmm.
everything she recalls was accurate. Do I think she was sincere? 100%.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's a different quality of witness. I thought in mind you were thinking of the James Files types, but
Yeah.
if you're talking about the on the field, the only most of those folks are sincere. The problem you run into is with somebody like a Jean Hill, who even her very original account is, before we knew what the Kennedy assassination would mean in the world of, you know, Jean, you know, Oliver Stone or whatever, was pretty, important conspiratorially
Mm-hmm.
in that direction. But she kept on adding on to her
Mm-hmm.
story. And then you have to be more surgical. What can we, and you have to be, and this is always a dangerous game. What do we believe when we're going to keep from her? What do we think she might have adds because she likes the publicity or wants
Mm-hmm.
money or whatever? Where are we going to separate those out? And when Akila Clemens never, as you said, she just said what she thought she saw and what appeared. To me, she has enormous credibility, and from a sincerity point of view, it's tough sometimes in a shooting to, you know, notoriously sudden, violent, unexpected, uh, traumatizing
Mm-hmm.
events. You can get things wrong.
And a lot of people don't put that into play, Stu. Like these, they don't. Okay, 6 seconds, right? I mean, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, Kennedy was already murdered by the time I did that 6 seconds, right? Okay, when you're reacting to that particular short amount of time, you're shocked for one. For two, it's lightning fast, in my opinion, in the grand scheme of things, right? So, in that quick of a time, how are you going to really remember? I mean, that 6 seconds to you at that particular time isn't going to slow down. It's like when you witness a car accident, right, Stu? It's just boom. It's
I'll just point it up. I'll give you one. I was involved in a car accident right around the time I first got my license. Father and police come to the scene. I give an account that I am certain of, right? But it doesn't. It's bad for me. Guess what? The police investigated it. Got data, got the light signals, and I was wrong, and it was the other person's fault. But you know, it was um, you know, 2 seconds that I had no expectation it was going to happen. It shocked the shit out of me.
mhm,
And again, and also these are things, other times like before the assassination when it's not shocking, it's stuff that you like. Why would you remember it? Like, why would you remember, you know, going to lunch with David, being at a table in a, you know, with David Ferry? I mean, you might, and what I was trying to say is, why would you remember in detail? Why would you expect anybody? Because it works both ways. You shouldn't dismiss the account because it has inaccuracies in it, but you shouldn't run to, celebrate it, because it might have inaccuracies in it. There's a good chance it'll have inaccuracies in it. You got to blend that all together. It's not the same thing as if I tell you every day I went to work I had a coffee. I don't even like coffee, but
mhm,
that you could, that's like 100%. There's no way I had a milkshake instead every
mhm,
single day, right?
mhm,
That's just unless I'm delusional.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a different kind of witness testimony than remembering a one-time event in detail prior when you didn't think there was any significance attached to it, which is a lot of Kennedy assassination stuff, or conversely, remembering exactly and having precise recall about what happened when there was a sudden traumatic, shocking event that happened either. It
Mm-hmm.
works both ways.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And I think about the Secret Service aspect of it, and I have a lot of respect for Vince Palomar and what he's been able to do, looking for through the research on this. And I think the thing for me, when it comes to the driver Greer, and of course, I'm not going to talk about the wild theory that everybody's talking about, but there is some negligence, even though, okay, like you have 6 seconds, like we talked about how quick that was, right? But as a Secret Service driver, you're like trained to drive. If you hear a firecracker, drive. You keep going. The national security protocol for that day was absolutely nonsense. But my point is that for him to stop and just to turn around, I get that. Okay, let's say for example, I'm with my family, right? And something horrible like that occurs, I hope to God nothing like that ever would ever occur. I would stop to turn around and look at my son or daughter and be like, "Are you okay?" Maybe that was a gut react. I mean, okay, I'm not defending him whatsoever, but what I am saying is that I think it's interesting because in a situation like that where you are protecting the president and you don't think that, like, let's just say he didn't know that anything was about to happen. There's a lot of people out there that think that the Secret Service knew what happened, right? But if I'm the driver, yes, I do keep driving on because I'm trained to do that. But what if this guy, because again, he was a placement driver, I guess his old driver died of a heart attack prior to that motorcade route. um it could have been a case of like just being green. Like, I mean, this guy was absolutely shocked to shit when he turned around. I mean, you have to put things like that, not you, but I'm talking about people that are looking at this because it happens so damn fast.
Oh no, I agree with you. You have to have some element of grace and skepticism at the same time
Hmm.
about what's happening. So yeah, I agree with you 100% with those kinds of witnesses.
Yeah, yeah. I just kind of wanted to make a point about that, but I do appreciate that. But yeah, so anyhow, so now the outlook for 2026, okay? Yeah, are you hoping to see that transpires? I think for me, I just want to, for my take about 2026, what Luna had talked about last year about the NBC tape that Oliver Stone saw, and I know that Bart Camp and has been talking about the Prayer Man and all that other stuff. And I think to me that has a little meat on the bone, absolutely. And we're going to be interviewing Bart here within next month or so. But the Wiegman film or the Darnell film, if they have a clear footage of this, and if let's say if Oswald, let's just say hypothetically, right? Just let's say if there is footage of him standing there with his Coca Cola, or what do you think that does to everything?
Well, I mean, that would that would end the discussion. I mean, if he's on those steps, it's game over for the lone assassin theory. It's a tricky matter. I have a little bit of background insight into that particular issue that I could speak sort of
Please do, please do.
vaguely about. I have enormous respect for Bart and the people and Greg Parker and those folks who've put that together. I was initially incredibly skeptical because it's a fuzzy image. In the best images we have, they're still not nearly clear enough for us to do what we need to do. It looks interesting. They did a lot of process of elimination type of stuff with witnesses as to who it could possibly be. My problem with that is I'm short, and every time I'm in a parade situation, there haven't been many, I have to find a spot where I can stand that I can stand over people. And I'm not giving a crap where I'm going during the parade. So if somebody short happened to have wandered onto the steps of the school book depository because they were sitting behind like Jerry Hemming or something, just to make it, somebody who's like 6'5" or something. You would like, I can understand that why they would do that. So I'm not going to go home. I'm not going to write home with a process of elimination, argument, especially when none of the other people on the steps saw what they said were Lee Harvey Oswald. What I did hear was this, and I got to speak very vaguely, right? Some folks got an opportunity to see something where this one of those two films was part of what they saw. It wasn't something that, like, they weren't there to see it. And whoever it was claimed to have had a super enhanced version of it that they were able to see. And if you looked at that, you saw a lot more things that would have convinced you that it was probably Oswald. The question doesn't become, I have every confidence they saw what has been claimed to have been seen, but there's some skepticism, and gets back to the issues we were talking about with the Files of the world and the Judith Bakers of the world, that whoever this person was, that it wasn't, that they weren't above board, that it wasn't a legitimate image. So once I heard that account, my mind shifts to, let's figure this out one way or the other. So we absolutely need to get the high resolution version of, or the best version of the film we can get in its original form, so that we can do all the kinds of enhancement that you can do, which, like a 8,000 DPI drum scan or whatever the heck it is, and we can see if that's valid or not. Because again, it would be a game changer. If Oswald's out on the front steps, he couldn't have been at the 6th floor.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And just on that basis alone, that because it's a game-changing piece of potential evidence, you absolutely need to pursue it and run it down. I don't know if we'll get it, and it's crazy if we don't, because that shouldn't be something that a private company should be able to hold exclusive rights over.
I agree with that 100%.
But there's legalities to it, and there's probably, unfortunately, all sorts of politicking to it that we don't want to have happen. But I do think this could lead us into a different area. I would hope it wouldn't be the only area of physical evidence that she stays on, because there's other things that I think are just as, if more promising, than the Weidman film, because that could be a bust, right? Um, that committee could potentially get a hold of or try and analyze, even though that's kind of out of their jurisdiction, that could really advance the understanding of the case. And I hope they do that.
Well, and then you got the Harvey files that they're going to be bringing out here to their full duration here. And for me, it's really interesting about the Harvey files because, like you mentioned earlier in the show, he was exiled, I guess, outcast out to Italy. And there have been numerous accounts of him having an alias, showing up in the United States, meeting with certain figures. I heard one of our guests talked about there was a potential meeting between him and Luce of Life magazine in the United States prior to the assassination. Now, if that's fodder or not, that remains to be seen. But the interesting thing is that you have that. How would that connect with any sort of international? Let me try to rephrase this. Okay, so how would this connect to any sort of international ties? Maybe let's say a Jean Suetre, who's all over the, he got deported the next day. Would there be any connections there, in your opinion, from Harvey to any of these international guys? Like you saw the men who killed Kennedy, they talk about Lucien Sartre and all these other theories. Would Harvey have like that sort of tie to this international play?
So, about to give you a whole lot of supposition.
Please.
Um, so Harvey was connected, was overseas with CIA. He obviously had numerous from his past work with. He ran the CIA's assassination operations. Executive action program essentially. So, and if you know anything about that executive action program, the people who were recruiting assassins or were the assassins or were the assassination operatives, etc., were European. So, you know, would they have dipped? And if you read Harvey's, by the way, if you read Harvey's sort of like how-to manual, Larry does this, I think, in his book Nexus, does an excellent job. I mean, he's basically saying I'd recruit, you know, foreign nationals to, pull off an assassination. I'd fake files on it, you know, all sorts of things. So it's absolutely within his capacity to go in that regard. I would add that, he's connected to some Pentagon folks. Um, was Lemnitzer, right? Those folks, I had somebody convincingly show me that Lemnitzer was somebody who was intimately familiar with the Gladio type stay behind operation. Or I sound like a complete, like, what kind of nut job conspiracy theorist are you, Stu Wexler? Right? Except that it's all documented, right? It's all well documented that we had stay behind networks that were engaged in the all sorts of false flag terrorist operations in Europe. It's crazy that it's documented, but the European governments, excuse
Bless
me,
you.
they
Bless you.
they they documented it. Um, and so what this person was describing to me, and again, it was fairly convincing, um, that the way that people view what we did with these Gladio type stay behind networks in Europe after the war, uh, that we always focus on the Galen network. Galen was one of the Nazi intelligence operatives, chief of intelligence or whatever, who we recruited, and then we, you know, exploited his sources, post war for our own benefit. And it appears that that was a part or had something to do with the Galen network. But there's two elements to uh, any sort of intelligence service. There's intelligence collection and analysis, and there's covert action. And nobody ever asks, well, what was the covert action side who was like the counterpart to the covert action side of the Galen network? Now, people have thrown possibilities out, and this gets into a whole other rabbit hole of interest, which is Otto Skorzeny. And you get the stuff that was done by Hank Albarelli and Alan Ken and Leslie Sharp, which I think has come into enough question that they have to do a lot more to forensically verify that diary. Um, but if you throw that idea away, Skorzeny would be a perfect kind of candidate to run the covert operation side of the Gladio type stay behind networks. And this is a long way of me saying that that stuff went on throughout the 60s into the 70s. If Harvey would be somebody who I would imagine, and Lemnitzer, and more importantly, who he was connected to in Europe, uh, they would have had access to those kinds of people. Um, but you're jumping through all sorts of speculative hoops to get that to potentially Dallas. Um, if you could show me that Harvey was running around Dallas and the United States as a whole in the 2 months before the assassination my ears would prick up because he's definitely on my list. I mean, he not only connects you to, you know, this network in Europe and to executive action, he connects the Castro assassination plots, and he connects to the surveillance operations in Mexico City. They all run out of Staff D. So, um, I mean, he's somebody who'd very much be on my list.
Yeah. And it kind of makes me wonder, like, again, like what's going to be in those when the whole thing is said and done. I mean, I think it is something that is going to give us a little bit more of an idea about what he was doing there. But when I look at um, his involvement just in general, I mean, you could see where he had a lot of disdain towards Kennedy. I mean, like obviously personally, with him and Bobby, they couldn't stand him, and vice versa. And there's an interview out there with Jeff Morley and um, Harvey's wife, where Harvey's wife is absolutely just sandbagging the Kennedys. I mean, like she just can't stand them. And if that's any inclination about how you know our reflection about like how he felt. Boy, he sure did hate them, didn't he?
Oh, I mean, that's why he's near the top of my list. I mean,
Mhm.
he absolutely. I mean, his biographer, who's a conventional biographer, like like freaking I don't even know who to name, but like no one. He's not coming from. He's not going to JFK Lancer, right?
Mhm.
The guy, right? The guy, and I love JFK Lancer. I'm just saying this guy is not one of us. Even he said I can't eliminate the possibility that this guy may have done something to John Kennedy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's that kind of a thing. I think again, I mean, with all this stuff, and this is where the mosaic comes in, right? You're not going to find a document, especially because Harvey talked about creating fake documents, which makes the whole thing, you know, deeply problematic. But you're not going to find a document where, like, Harvey's like, yeah, I met with, Lucien Sarti, on November 21st. But you may get enough where he becomes a suspicious enough character where a lot of people are willing to say maybe he probably had something to do with it. I think we have a little bit more to go than where we are, but
Mhm.
uh, yeah, he's definitely somebody on the candidate list, and I hope in 2026 we get more files on
Mhm.
him from Luna. Um, Absolutely.
So when we were off the air, and I teased this in the beginning of the show. You mentioned something that kind of made my jaw drop a little bit about how the CIA talked about technology back in the '60s, and what like you didn't mention Photoshop. I took it as Photoshop-ish kind of or alteration, right? And I did relate it earlier to the backyard photo when we were talking about that earlier. Will you explain that story to our audience, what you talked to me about? Because I find it absolutely fascinating.
So Greg Burnham, another researcher, posted a just fascinating document on the JFK Education Forum from these releases. And what it relates to is there's photographs from when Oswald visited Mexico City in September of 1963. And a lot of people who are familiar with the case will know that there's a set of photographs of a guy who initially the government tried to say was Lee Harvey Oswald, or could have been, and no one on earth would say this guy was Lee Harvey Oswald. He was like heavy set, like goatee hair kind of situation. It was not anything like Lee Harvey Oswald. In fact, incorrectly, when she was shown apparently a briefly shown the picture, Marguerite claimed that it was Jack Ruby, and it is closer to Ruby than it is Oswald, but it's not Ruby, absolutely not. But it created problems, and you know we need more contextual information because the dates could be important. But what Greg found was they're actually talking at one point, they being the CIA, can we do something to manipulate the images of this person from Mexico City so he looks like a different person. Um, and I'm sure it's, whatever the version of photo retouching was in 1963. But just the fact that they were willing to consider that raises all kinds of questions about what they're willing to do and not do. My understanding is people have seen documents that raise similar questions about um, doctoring transcripts of the conversations that you intercept overseas in places like Mexico City. You put that together and it creates all sorts of questions, and unfortunately, probably muddies the waters even more.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know
Mm-hmm.
what to believe anymore. But that's just the fact that they were willing to entertain that thought, which was Greg's point,
Mm-hmm.
um, is very interesting.
It really is. I mean, yeah, when you told me that earlier, my jaw was like, "What? Wow!" I couldn't believe that. And speaking of files, I wanted to talk about like nuggets in the files, even though we haven't been able to find anything. And I know that we talked about the files in the beginning of the show, but I kind of want to circle back around a little bit. I found a file in general. I know Jim DiEugenio has looked at it before, and other researchers have, and they've actually talked about it. But I think it's an important breadcrumb to bring up, and I want to get your thoughts on it. It's the Underhill document. Okay, this one has always fascinated me because the fact is that while you have a whole lot of generic stuff in those files, you find this little breadcrumb in there, and it's about this man who is privy to what happened to and what he thinks happened, right? And he goes, pardon my language, ape shit after this, and he's trying to tell anybody that he can that he knows what happens, and he's a respected CIA officer. And then later on, he ends up committing suicide allegedly. That document itself tells me that like that's a little breadcrumb possibly to figure out what could have happened.
Well, I do want to correct one thing. He wasn't a CIA officer. He was a well-respected military journalist,
Journalist, excuse me, please
right?
forgive me.
Um, and I want to recommend to everybody in the audience, and I'll recommend it to you. No one does a more thorough analysis on this than Larry Hancock did. I believe in Someone Would Have Talked, the updated edition.
Mm,
He went super in depth on Underhill. And to make a long story short, the trick with Underhill is if you look at who he's connected to, who he investigates, and who his sources are, if there's somebody who could have, and of course you're always going to be left with the could have because he dies under mysterious circumstances, he seems to be losing his mind a little bit. It's tough to know, was he already predisposed in that direction, or did the assassination turn him that way, or did both? Sometimes you could have somebody who's having psychological problems and they come into information about something and they just go further into, you know, psychosis. One doesn't necessarily exclude the other. He is exactly the kind of person who, like almost in a movie, where, like the movies where the reporter comes into a source and an information and suddenly they're fearing for their lives, and that's like the whole movie. He's certainly that kind of guy. And if Larry goes into a lot of depth on the kind of people who he would have been analyzing, so to speak, or been on the periphery of. And then, Larry does a great job of this always, is like, well, if you look at where they stack up independently in the Kennedy assassination narrative, isn't it interesting that it's Gary Underhill? So I strongly recommend that folks read Larry's book. Someone Would Have Talked.
yeah, I'll put that on the graphic when I get this done edited. I'll make sure that I have it up on the screen so that people can get that now, and I'll look at that as well. So I appreciate the reference on that. So, well, in 2026, it is, it's going to be a vital. I would say it's actually I my thought process on this, Stu. I think that it's a possibility, maybe not in our lifetime, but I would say maybe our kids' lifetime or their kids' lifetime, I think that we can actually get this thing figured out. Only because why I say this is because I I I think that the groundwork that the current people are doing right now is starting to loosen some things up, and I think people like yourself, and I think the Larry Hancocks of the world, and the Eugenios and all these other people that are really, but I think it's up to us to really keep pushing the narrative out there to make more people know about this, not be so guarded with the information that we have. I think we should share the information. I think we should make people understand that this is a grave injustice what happened 62 years ago. Now my question to you is on this is that, do you agree with me? Do you think that this thing will, I mean, I'm not saying that we will ever figure out the shooters, because I think I
Well,
think that's long gone. But I'm
well,
talking about the
I'll tell
case.
you, I'm hopeful, and I'm even hopeful potentially on potentially the shooter's situation, and I'll tell you why. First off, it looks like, I mean, I'm still waiting for this to be fully hashed out, but it looks like we may have just solved Jack the Ripper, right? That's 100, what, 50 years ago?
Hmm. Hmm.
140? We may have just solved it with modern technology and some sleuthing. And it was somebody who people have suspected for a long time, and I just want to make sure everything gets. That would be crazy. And there's similar kinds of physical evidence in this case that the number one thing in JFK case, and I don't want to get too much into it, there's even more of it in the MLK case, is fingerprints. And there's the fingerprints on the boxes, and there are the fingerprints that need to be, you need to do a little bit more, and you may not be able to do it, but it's possible that you can use some of the modern technology to extract more of the fingerprints that we have on the rifle, and you can run those through something called the next generation information system identification system. Used to be AFIS, and there's tens of thousands of fingerprints on there. Cases have been solved that are older than the Kennedy assassination with AFIS. There was a case in San Diego. There's a 48-hour special called The Ghosts of El Segundo. Um, they solved the case that was like 1957 using fingerprint evidence. And by the way, there's fingerprint evidence from the hood of J.D. Tippett's car. That's another big one, right? Um, we may be able to get a match. And that's one of the big things I'm really hoping she does, because unlike, there's physical evidence like the Wyman film could tell you if it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and we may never get a definitive on that, but it wasn't. The official version is garbage. It can tell you that if that was Lee Harvey Oswald, right? It can't tell you who did it. Fingerprints might be able to, though. If somebody made a mistake, we could possibly figure out who did this, and meaning they took off their gloves, whatever it was. But there are unidentified prints, and I really hope they run it. Any agency in the country can run it. If your favorite uncle is retiring from the crime lab in Podunk, Iowa, please email me, because I would love for anyone. It could be anyone. It's been done before, by the way. People have taken fingerprints from cases out of jurisdiction into other jurisdictions and solved cases as private citizens. It's not common. It's not very common at all. I am just hoping somebody does it. I'm hoping the Luna Committee does it, because, again, why not? And then independently, I do think we could possibly put a mosaic together that's at least going to provide a context for who did it that's very hard to ignore. I think we're already going in that direction. It's very tough to close the circle unless you can get it to somebody, to get to Oswald in October and November of 1963, as I said before, but it could potentially be done. And so that's my hope, that we can do that. We have to do it quick, though, because my big concern is that AI is going to reach a point where people are just going to make shit up, and we're going to have a very difficult time
Mm-hmm.
telling the difference.
Well, as
I think we.
I'm an AI developer, so I do it professionally. So I agree with you 100%. That's our fear too, is that the people are going to really start taking over. And it's a good tool, mind you. I mean, it's phenomenal,
Oh,
right?
it could be used for our benefit, a hundred
Yeah,
percent.
absolutely. But when you talk about muddying the waters, like people have been muddying, and this thing can absolutely just, you know, a- what did the Tribe Called Quest say? Like shit the waters.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, yeah, it could completely. Yeah. No,
I
we
mean,
don't.
I'm not 100% sure it's not already happening with the Epstein files,
Oh yeah. You're
right?
absolutely.
Because there's certainly some stuff in there that seems to be fake.
Well, it's
Um,
they have the new photo analyzing tool with AI, and I know it is artificial, and I get that, but that is another thing. But I agree with you. The fingerprint thing is going to be that thing is going to be. I mean, the photo analyzing tool will actually tell you if thing is something is fake or not. So, like for example, the background, the backyard photo, it would be able to tell you if that thing was altered.
yeah, I'm
Uh,
hoping we get to that stage too. And again, with all of those things, which I absolutely, you're not going to find a bigger supporter of doing stuff like that than me. Um, all of that is great because it will either confirm or refute 100% elements of the official theory where you can't do anything more after that, right?
mhm,
So if the backer photos are fake, it's done. Like you can't reasonably run around saying that there's not a conspiracy at that point.
mhm.
Um, but the difference with the fingerprints is it can actually tell you people who did do it.
The match. It's a
The
match. Yep.
match, not 100% guaranteed, but again, after 9/11, they jacked that database up like you can't believe. Um, and I really do have some hope that we're going to be able to run those prints. Now it's not a so that people know it gives you output of potential like 6 or 7 potential matches. You still need an expert to do it, and it's very important that that expert does it without having any bias towards one particular thing or not thing, right? Um, but it's hugely promising,
Mm.
and that's what I hope happens.
And I agree with you 100% on that. So, he's the author of The Awful Grace of God and America's Secret Jihad. He also is a co-author with Larry Hancock in Killing King. Am I right? Killing King,
Correct.
racial terrorist James Earl Ray, and the plot to assassinate Martin Luther King. Um, I would. We're about to wrap up here in just a second, Stu. But what I would love to ask you is like if you would want to come for a part two with our show, because I mean I think you've been absolutely valuable, and our listeners would just, I mean, they're gonna really love this episode.
Anytime, I love to do it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And before we part, we always have our guests and myself do a final take. Kind of like how, Jim Rome usually did it, or like pardon the interruption and stuff. That's kind of how we do it. But my final take is I want to thank Stu for being on the show. His book link is going to be at the bottom here with the pictures of his books. Um, and you can order those on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or wherever you can get your books. But I really want to thank Stu for coming on short notice. He did me a solid on this, so I do thank him. I want to wish everybody a happy holidays and happy New Year season. The big thing for me going forward with this case is just to make sure, like Stu has been talking about tonight, is to make sure you always keep an open mind on things. Because if you don't, and if you die on a hill, you're going to be left behind. Well, people tend to respect somebody that has an open mind. And I think in a case like this that is so deep, so arduous when it comes to just thinking, it's always good to always keep your mind open to receive rather than to exercise it. So that's my final take. Stu, what do you got?
I would say, and this gets to a lot of the themes of the stuff that you've been talking about, if we could unite on process, right? Let's run the fingerprints. Let's not care what their outcome is. Let's just unite on getting them run, right? If we unite on, let's get the Harvey file. Who gives a crap if it clears Harvey? Let's get it, right? Let's unite on getting it, right? Let's unite on getting the Weidman film. Who cares if it shows him or not? It doesn't mean he's guilty if he's not in it, right? Let's just unite on getting it, because we can be a powerful force if we unite and combine our resources to make these things happen. Again, if you know somebody who's on a police force and is retiring and could care less, we don't need to use the government at all. You just contact me and we'll figure this stuff out, right? But let's just try and make that happen and make the process happen rather than die on our heels. So that would be my point.
And I thank you, Mr. Stu Wexler. Again, pick up his books at Amazon.com, which is The Awful Grace of God, and of course, America's Secret Jihad. Links at the bottom. I want to thank everybody for watching this show. Stu, thank you again, humbly. And everybody have a happy new year. And the truth is out there.